for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. Are there any questions?
Member for Barton.
The member for Barton has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm he introduced no job, no pay legislation in 2015 to deny payments to families who refuse to get their children vaccinated? Why does the Prime Minister pretend he is opposed to vaccine mandates when he imposed some of the strongest vaccine mandates in the country on children?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I set out very clearly in this House yesterday, as Prime Minister, I took the proposal for mandatory vaccines for aged care workers to the Premiers and Chief Ministers in June, and it was not until mid to late August until those mandates were put in place by those state and territory administrations around the country. The government's policy on vaccines in relation to mandates has not been a binary one, Mr Speaker. It has been a carefully considered one based on the best possible medical advice, on the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, in fact, Mr Speaker, and indeed the unified position that was taken on mandates by the AHPPC, the medical expert panel, which has guided us all the way through this pandemic, has only had unanimous positions on mandated vaccines in relation to health workers, my understand, aged care workers and disability workers. Mr Speaker, that is the policy of the Commonwealth Government. Now, indeed, other states and territories around the country have gone further on the basis, I assume, of advice received by their own chief health officers. But I stress the position that the Commonwealth has taken on mandatory vaccines has been based on the advice of the Chief Medical Officer and indeed was based on the advice of the expert medical panel, which comprises all Chief Health Officers of the states and territories and the Chief Medical Officer. So for those opposite to falsely suggest that the government somehow has any truck with anti-vaxxing, Mr Speaker, is false. Because we, in fact, Mr Speaker, as a government, it is the policy of our government that we have supported those mandates in very specific circumstances with people who are working with very vulnerable people. It has also been our policy to allow the law of this land, under our courts, Mr Speaker, to enable businesses, where they wish to, exercising their rights, to exercise judgments about their own staff, Mr Speaker, and those who consume their services. That is their right, Mr Speaker. We believe that those decisions should be taken by those businesses, and that's the position we've adopted as a government, Mr Speaker. And in relation to the no jab, no pay, Mr Speaker, that is true. We withdrew, Mr Speaker, we removed an entitlement to a benefit for those who did not have their children vaccinated, who are going into childcare facilities, Mr Speaker, and we have one of the highest rates of child immunisation in the world, Mr Speaker. So that is a good policy. We didn't pay them to do it, Mr Speaker. We didn't offer them cash, because we understood, Mr Speaker, that if people are receiving a benefit from the government, if people are receiving a benefit from the government,
Members
Mr.
on my
Speaker,
left,
that it is only reasonable to expect that individuals
Prime Minister's
would
time
comply.
has expired. The member for Boothby has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and sincere congratulations on your election. My question is to the Prime Minister. Australians are emerging from restrictions with increasing confidence about our economic recovery. Will the Prime Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government is driving that confidence by delivering on our plan to secure the economy and create more jobs for Australians?
The Prime Minister.
It's like all the South Australians in the House. I'm sorry.
No, the Prime Minister has a call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Boothby for her question. Mr Speaker, the member for Boothby and all South Australians in this House, indeed I'm sure all Australians will be welcoming the fact that South Australia are opening up today. Opening up today under the national plan, a national plan that continues to ensure we're building confidence in the reopening of Australia, A reopening that from the 1st of December will see students coming back to Australia. It will see skilled migrants, much needed in this country, coming back to Australia, particularly in South Australia, Mr Speaker. In addition to that, people and visitors coming from Singapore already and Japan and the Republic of Korea to be added to that very, very shortly on the 1st of December. Australia is opening up. Australians are looking forward, Mr Speaker. I am confident about Australia's economic future, but I am not naive, Mr Speaker, to the threats that are present in the global economy and indeed that we're confronting with here in Australia, and I know that we have to work hard to secure this economic recovery. It cannot be taken for granted, and that's why economic management has never been more important, as Australians have worked so hard through this pandemic to secure one of the lowest fatality rates in the world, one of the strongest economies coming through the pandemic, and also one of the highest rates of vaccination to protect Australians going into the post-COVID recovery phase, Mr Speaker. We must ensure we secure that economic recovery, Mr Speaker, and that's why we are the party not just of lower taxes, but lower taxes that are legislated, Mr Speaker. And in just the last 3 months, some $10 billion and more of tax relief provided and delivered to Australians, Mr Speaker, and particularly supporting small businesses with lower taxes at 25%. More jobs, Mr Speaker. There are 250,000 jobs right now out there advertised for Australians to go and get those jobs, Mr Speaker, and fire up that economic recovery that is underway. And in particular, we're seeing more women in those jobs, and we've been seeing record levels of women's economic participation in the workforce. Skills, Mr Speaker, 217,400 Australians in training right now for trade apprentices in this country. That is the highest level since 1963, Mr Speaker, before I was even born, Mr Speaker. And we are seeing more people in training for those trade apprentices now, which will be supporting our manufacturing industries, which we're also backing in. Backing in those manufacturing industries, we have 1 million people now, back on the most recent figures, working in the manufacturing industry. Under Labor, 1 in 8 manufacturing jobs went. We have turned that around with our economic policies. This is the economic recovery plan, Mr Speaker, that Australians need, that they depend on. It cannot be taken for granted. Economic management matters, Mr Speaker, and we will secure that recovery.
Expired. The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Why did the Prime Minister in his last answer say that he didn't pay parents to vaccinate their children when that is exactly what his government did?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the entitlement, Mr Speaker, which is provided to Australians that the member refers to, was not being made to those who weren't getting their children vaccinated to attend childcare. That is the policy. That is the withdrawing of a payment, Mr Speaker, not the paying of it. Not the paying of it, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition seems confused.
Members on my left.
This. He seems confused about it, Mr Speaker. I know what the Leader of the Opposition's policy was over these last months. He wanted to pay people with a cash bribe to get vaccinated, Mr Speaker. That was the Leader of the Opposition's policy.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. On relevance, this went to the Prime Minister's no jab, no pay policy, and the fact that he once again, before the chamber, misled the parliament in saying that he didn't pay people. That's why it was called no jab, no pay, because you were paying people.
Leader of the House has the call.
Mr Speaker, there are many occasions where the Leader of the Opposition comes to the dispatch box under the guise of making a point of order. It doesn't happen. He makes a political statement from the dispatch box, and he should be ruled out of order.
The Leader of the House will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister is in order, and he is being relevant.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition wanted to be the $6 billion man, Mr Speaker, on paying people for vaccines they'd already had. That was his policy. Economic recklessness, Mr Speaker.
The Manager of Opposition Business would know that there is one point of order on relevance. Yes, what's the point of order?
On the order of the House, Mr Speaker.
The Manager of Opposition will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business, there is one opportunity to raise a point of order on relevance. Yes. What's the point of order, Manager?
Point of order is with respect to the ruling that you made, where you ruled that the Prime Minister was in order on the basis that he was being relevant to the question. That's what you ruled.
Correct.
And to that ruling, I'm saying, how can it be, when a question has nothing to do with Labor policy, that you're now going to allow an answer like this? How does that happen?
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. The Prime Minister has the call, and the Prime Minister is relevant.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The policies that we've put in place have ensured that we've had record levels not only of child immunisation, Mr. Speaker, but the policies we've pursued through the pandemic was not to pay people cash bribes, as the Labor leader wished to do, Mr. Speaker, but Mr. Speaker, he's very precious today, Mr.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Has the Prime Minister finished his answer? The Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister just made a very specific allegation which was unparliamentary. Against a member of Parliament. If he wants to accuse people
the Leader of the Opposition
of that, he needs to withdraw, Mr. Speaker. It cannot be allowed to stand. If that's allowed to stand, then it'll be a free-for-all, Mr. Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. It shouldn't come as any great surprise that the level of interjections was so great that I actually didn't hear what the Prime Minister said. Did the Prime Minister make an unparliamentary comment? Well, I'm not in a position. The Leader of the Opposition will just resume his seat for a moment. If the level of interjections is so high that I simply could not hear what the Prime Minister is saying, well then it shouldn't come as any great surprise that I can't rule on that. The Prime Minister has indicated the Manager of Opposition Business will just resume his seat for a moment. The Prime Minister has the call. Are you making another point of order? What's the point of order?
In what you dealt with just then, you asked the Prime Minister whether or not he believed he'd said something unparliamentary. What I'm putting to you is so that you know what was said. It was an accusation using a term that is a criminal offence. Now, if you're going to allow that to stand, that is a very significant shift. Very significant shift.
The Manager of Opposition
The
Business.
use of the word bribe has not been allowed in this House. If you're now going to shift that ruling, then if you're going to make that as a formal ruling, then do it up front, but not.
The Manager of Opposition Business, as I indicated just a moment ago, I didn't hear what
That's why I'm letting you know what was said.
So if the Prime Minister used an allegation of bribery, then the Prime Minister should withdraw it.
Make no such accusation against any individual member. I said I make none now. Mr. Speaker.
Order.
I was talking about his policy, Mr.
The Prime Minister
Speaker.
will resume
and
his
what
seat.
it done.
Order. The level of interjections is too high. If I can't hear what's being said,
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to withdraw if it assists the House.
I thank the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear about the Labor policy, what it was. This Leader of the Opposition wanted to pay people to get vaccinations. He wanted to pay people cash, Mr. Speaker.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat for one moment. I just want to make very clear that if members of this House are wanting me to be able to rule on issues, I need to be able to hear them. So the level of interjections are far too high, and I would appreciate if those honourable members would conduct themselves appropriately. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, that is the Labor policy, to have paid people who'd already had vaccinations. Now, I can understand why the Leader of the Labor Party is so embarrassed about this policy. It was a fiscally reckless policy, and it's why he can't be trusted with the nation's finances.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. I would just— the Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The question didn't refer to Labor Party policies, Prime Minister, and I'd ask you to be relevant to the question, please.
Speaker, if the question was about Labor Party policies, it would be a very short answer, Mr Speaker, because there's not many out there, I've got to tell you, Mr Speaker, and there's only one thing worse, Mr Speaker, than Australians not knowing what Labor would do, Mr Speaker, is then not knowing what Labor would do, because they're trying to sneak their way into government, Mr Speaker. This is a very sneaky leader of...
Has the Prime Minister completed his answer? The member for Flynn has the
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and congratulations. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how the Morrison-Joyce government is providing critical infrastructure which supports the economic growth of regional Australia? And is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
Point of order? Yes, the Manager of Opposition Business.
One which I expect you'd be anticipating, Mr Speaker, but different speakers have ruled as to whether alternative policies are to be allowed in questions. Standing orders make clear that ministers are to be asked about their ministerial responsibility. There is no way that they can be responsible for the policies of another political party. They are responsible for the policies of a government. And I ask that the last part of the question be ruled out of order, as a number of previous speakers have done.
In accordance with the precedent, with at the very least the previous speaker, the ministers can be asked on alternative policies, and the question is in order. The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you I thank the honourable member for his question, Mr Speaker, and it seems that you're having another quiet day in the office. So welcome to the job, I hope. Mr Speaker, one always acknowledges the work that the member for Flynn has done in promoting such things as the extension and fighting for the extension of the inland rail from Toowoomba down to Gladstone, because we know that's so vitally important to the people of the great city of Gladstone and also to the people in the seat of Flynn, as well as Capricorn, as well as Dawson. This is vital infrastructure, and it's the sort of thing that the member for Flynn has stood behind, just like the infrastructure that's so vitally important, such as mobile phone towers, which this side of the House has been paramount in making sure that people get that vital communications infrastructure into so many areas, or bridges to renewal, so that and roads to renewal or bridges to renewal, to make sure that we can get the transport operators with their capacity to have the load limit so they can get their product across the bridges to get them to markets, to earn money for our nation. Or whether it's roads to recovery, whether it's a rail infrastructure from inland rail to other rail across our nation, Pacific Highway, Bruce Highway, the dams from Scottsdale to Rookwood Weir. This is the sort of vital infrastructure that builds our nation. Inland rail, Outback Way, connecting Western Australia, the Northern Territory through the Cedarling-Gyari and into Western Queensland, Western Sydney Airport. These are all vital components of what this side of the House has been able to give to our nation, deliver to our nation, and to give a real vision. But, Mr Speaker, it's also important to understand that there are people who believe they're above the law. And the protests that have been happening lately against the export of some of our crucial minerals, especially the 200 coal trains that were delayed in the last 2 weeks in the Hunter, belies the fact that these people believe that they're above the law and that they can stand in the way of the royalties that are earned by the state to pay for the hospitals, pay for the police, pay for the schools, the tax revenue that pays for the NDIS, pays for so much of that social infrastructure we take for granted, and underpins the value of our currency. And by underpinning the value of our currency, making sure that we get the terms of trade that doesn't start inspiring inflation is so important. I'm absolutely pleased to see that the coalition government at a state level has made a dramatic stand against these people and has said there's no longer going to be a $200 slap on the wrist, that some of them, by reason of these dangerous actions, putting at risk not only our economy but the lives of people who work on the railway lines, that this may involve an incarcerated term.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Can the Deputy Prime Minister confirm that the first chair of Infrastructure Australia was Sir Ron Eddington, who led Cathay Pacific, British Airways and was director of JP Morgan and News Corp? Can he also confirm the government has decided, but not yet announced, that the new chair of Infrastructure Australia will be the retiring mayor of Tamworth, Col Murray, who has described himself as a fairly solid Barnaby supporter?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry that the hypocrisy is what is wrong with the mayor, the former mayor of Tamworth. Does not have quite enough letters after his name to be considered worthy by the Labor Party. A person who's been in the construction industry for 25 years, a person who's one of the leading mayors in New South Wales, a person who's underpinned the growth of one of our great regional cities. But of course, what we see in the Labor Party side, once we start having someone from a regional area, the Labor Party doesn't like that. They don't like that. They're not quite good enough. They're not quite good enough. And this goes to show in grand form, how the Labor Party does not believe in regional Australia. They don't want representation from regional Australia at a prominent level. In fact, we have the member for Ballarat, of all people, to come and absolutely backslam a regional person. I'm sorry. What would you have said about Chifley? That his train wasn't big enough? I mean, what is it? What has happened to the Labor Party? They are now the people that stand behind them. Unless you are endowed with more letters after your name than an alphabet, they just say that you're not good enough. Not good enough. The academic snobs that now reside on the other side. They now reside on the other side. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, once we had a problem about them just being sneaky. Now they're sneaky snobs. This is what we're getting. It's a new world order. So we can say to people of regional Australia that if you get yourself a Labor government, get ready to get sacked, because they don't believe in regional people. They don't believe in the coal miners. They don't believe in people who've made an honest day's work, standing in a private business, building it up, and then going into community service as a senior mayor of a senior regional city in Australia. It's not good enough for the Labor Party. Oh no, you've got to live in Grainler if you want a job in this joint. You've got to come from Grainler. And how am I going? All right.
You've got 40 seconds.
I like this bloke more than the last fella. But this is it. What you're going to have if you get a Labor government is here he is.
The Leader of the Opposition, on a point of order?
Yeah.
On a point of order?
Yes.
Leader of the Opposition.
Given he gave himself up, Mr. Speaker, that he wasn't being relevant, he's not being relevant to the question. This is about the qualifications for a serious job, the Chair of Infrastructure Australia.
The Leader of the Opposition.
From a government that promised to reappoint Sir Rod Eddington to that job.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Deputy Prime Minister is being relevant. The Deputy Prime Minister.
Let me relevant, Mr. Speaker. And we go back to the conceit of these people on the other side who want Sandstone Sandy as the only person who could possibly lead Infrastructure Australia. So, because the Labor Party believes a person who earned an honest job, had an honest job, you've already had one point of order.
Prime Minister
you can't have two. You should know
resume
that.
his seat. The Leader of the Opposition. On a point of order?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
What's the point of order?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. A point of order. Point of order. It goes to the minister defying your ruling. He continues to just rave on about the Labor Party. The question was about the qualifications of the person who he has appointed, his mate.
That's an imputation right there.
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call. The Deputy Prime Minister is
Mr.
being
Speaker,
relevant.
I'd just like to say we will stand behind honest people.
Order.
You look after the sneaky snobs.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has expired. And I give the call to the member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Emergency
Order.
Management.
The member for Mayo will resume her seat. The Deputy Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, I can't hear the question being asked. The member for Mayo has the call, and I'll get you to start your question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Emergency Management and National Recovery Resilience. The Drought Communities Small Business Support Program has helped many off-farm rural businesses in my electorate who have experienced hardship caused by drought, bushfires, hail damage and Covet. This program is doing a power of good for rural businesses right across Australia. So why is the government ending this funding at Christmas?
The Minister representing the Minister for Emergency Management has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question and acknowledge the hard work that she's undertaken during last year's Black Summer events and the impact it's had on her communities. The government isn't ending these programs. In fact, we've put it as part of the new Recovery and Resilience Agency, led by Shane Stone, and we're working through those contracts, not just with respect to the small business but also the Rural Financial Counselling Service. We've gone out to those particular providers to make sure that the support that is provided to them is adequate, and understanding the demand that will be required moving forward, and understanding the time in terms of recovery for these communities is different. The recovery process against every community heals differently, and so we are working with them through Shane Stone and his agency and the Rural Financial Counselling Service, who have led this process for us because they have the experience and the corporate knowledge in which to run out to farmers but now into small businesses. And so the agency will be making further announcements soon with respect to those furthering of those contracts and the resourcing, working across the nation, understanding that the demand shifts in some regions is different to others, and how do we move some of those people into the regions where demand is still there. So this has been handled as delicately and openly as we possibly can, and I know that Shane Stone is working with people on the ground. We've tried to make sure that this has been a locally led recovery, of having boots on the ground and having his agency have people sitting around kitchen tables, understanding exactly you've been able to articulate the demands that are out there for these people to get back up on their feet. And I'm happy to make sure that I can provide you with further details specific to your counselling area, and making sure that if there are any inadequacies, I'm happy to make sure that we can facilitate that with Mr Stone.
The member for Bass has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House of the Morrison government's clear and established record of cutting taxes for families and businesses, and how this delivers more jobs for all Australians? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
I thank the member for Bass for her question. And firstly, can I congratulate you, Mr Speaker, on your elevation to this very important position. Member for Bass has been a local mayor in her local area, a farmer and someone who's dedicated to the people across her community. And there are more than 40,000 constituents across the member's electorate who are getting tax relief as a result of policies passed by this side of the House. Now, Mr Speaker, I can confirm to the parliament today that consumer confidence was up again today. 9 out of the last 11 weeks, consumer confidence has risen. Business confidence today is higher than pre-pandemic levels, and that job ads are more than 30% higher than they were going into the pandemic. And female workforce participation, despite the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression, female workforce participation today is higher than when we came to government. And the gender pay gap is lower than when we came to government. And the unemployment rate is lower than when we came to government, Mr Speaker. And one of the reasons why the Australian economy is proven to be so resilient and now has the momentum of the economic recovery is because this government has been cutting taxes for Australian families and businesses. Small business company tax rate down to 25%, Mr Speaker, the lowest in 50 years. Business investment incentives that have seen machinery and equipment sales the highest in 20 years. And income tax cuts, Mr Speaker, that have delivered for someone on $60,000, a tradie or a truckie or a teacher or a nurse, $6,480 better off. Now I'm asked, are there any alternative policies? Well, we know that the Labor Party promised at the last election $387 billion of higher taxes, and at the next election they will again deliver higher taxes for the Australian people. They will deliver higher taxes for the Australian people. Now, the Labor Party this time will be a lot more cagey, Mr Speaker. This time they will like to sneak into government. They won't come clean with the Australian people about their tax plans. But we know that the Shadow Treasurer, the member for Rankin, took a $27 billion higher tax on family businesses to his shadow cabinet earlier this year, Mr Speaker. And we know that when it came to the stage-free legislated tax cuts, he did not support them. Only this side of the House will deliver lower taxes for all Australians.
The member for Whitlam has the call.
Speaker, question to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister claimed he'd never used the phrase Shanghai Sam in relation to former Senator Sam Dastyari. Given he used that exact phrase 17 times on 11 occasions, why did the Prime Minister claim he had never used the term when that simply wasn't true?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm not aware of the claim that you're referring to, and I'm not going to take it at face value from those opposite, Mr Speaker.
Prime Minister,
in terms of
order. I'll get the Prime Minister starting. I couldn't hear that.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm not aware of the claim that the member is making, and I'm not about to accept claims at face value from those opposite, Mr Speaker. I'm not about to accept that from those opposite. The Labor Party thinks sledging, whining and whinging is a policy, Mr Speaker. That's not how you actually run a government, Mr Speaker. They have no alternative plans. They have no alternative policies. So they come here every day and they engage in personal attacks on me as Prime Minister. That's okay. Bring it on. Bring it on, Mr Speaker. You want to engage in personal sledging and have a crack at where I go for holidays, and if I go home and spend Father's Day with my family, Mr Speaker, bring it on, Mr Speaker. Bring it on.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Just one moment. Order. If I can't hear the Prime Minister, I can't rule on points of order. The Manager of Opposition Business.
On direct relevance, Mr Speaker, there is no way that this is relevant to any of the 17 times that he used the term that he's being asked about.
I would ask the Prime Minister to be relevant to the question. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, but on the topic, Mr Speaker, the former Senator Dastyari, the former Labor Senator Dastyari, I remember those issues very well because it was the former Labor Senator Dastyari who stood up with an official—
Member for Wills.
Sorry.
I was just calling. I was correcting the member for Wills and
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I remember it was the former Labor Senator Dastyari who disgraced himself, Mr Speaker, by undermining, Mr Speaker, Australia's sovereignty in relation to a foreign country. That's what the former Senator Dastyari did, Mr Speaker, and he had to leave this place in disgrace. Mr Speaker, he had to leave this place in disgrace. As we have seen so many other Labor members, whether at state level or former Labor members at this place, up on charges, off to jail. They've got enough people in Silverwater Prison now to start a branch of the Labor Party there, Mr Speaker. That's what's going on with the Labor Party, and you can't trust Labor with money, Mr Speaker, because they're always after yours.
Order. 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 Once again, the level of interjections is too high. The member for Longman has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Morrison government's substantial tax-cutting agenda supporting Australians through the COVID-19 pandemic, and how is it strengthening the Australian economy's capacity to rebound from its economic effects? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Longman for his question and acknowledge his experience running his own small business, Mr Speaker. And across his electorate, 65,000 people are getting tax relief as a result of policies supported by this side of the House. And there are 14,000 small businesses in the electorate of Longman that are eligible for the expanded instant asset write-off. And one of those businesses is Taipan Hoses, an irrigation company in Caboolture that has used the expanded instant asset write-off to buy forklifts, to buy stackers, to buy a hydraulic hose testing equipment, Mr Speaker. And that is one example of thousands of examples across electorates in this country of businesses growing and investing in themselves in order to employ more Australians and to capitalise on the investment incentives that we have provided. Now, this side of the House believes in lower taxes. It's a key policy and philosophy of the coalition to encourage aspiration and reward effort and allow Australians to keep more of what they earn. And that includes the $300 billion of legislated income tax cuts, Mr Speaker, that we have moved through this parliament, including a significant structural reform, abolishing a whole tax bracket, the 37 cents in the dollar tax bracket, and the small business tax cuts that now see at 25 cents in the dollar company tax for businesses with a turnover of less than $50 million at their lowest level in 50 years. And that has seen these small businesses being able to weather the storm of the pandemic, Mr Speaker. $5 billion of tax relief for small businesses this year and next. And small and medium-sized businesses have employed an additional 600,000 people between April last year and September of this year. That's 1,300 a day. And our business investment incentives have helped see an increase in machinery and equipment sales to be the strongest in 20 years. This is what lower taxes is helping to do across the Australian economy: create jobs, reward effort and encourage aspiration. It's in stark contrast to those opposite, because those opposite don't believe in lower taxes. Those opposite only promise higher taxes, Mr Speaker. That's what they took to the Australian people: higher taxes on your superannuation, higher taxes on your retirement savings, higher taxes on your income, higher taxes on housing, Mr Speaker. That is what the Labor Party took to the Australian people. And they said to the Australian people, if you don't like our policies, don't vote for it. This time round, the Labor Party's a lot more cagey. They're not coming clean with the Australian people. They're a lot more sneaky.
The Treasurer's time has expired. The member for Corio has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister said reports that he had tried to invite Brian Houston to the White House were gossip. Why did the Prime Minister say that when it just wasn't true?
The Prime Minister
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I corrected all those matters on the record, Mr Speaker, as those opposite are fully aware.
The member for Herbert has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government's international partnerships will provide the Australian Defence Force with the capability edge to protect Australians in the changing geostrategic environment? Is the Minister aware of any alternative?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question, acknowledge his service to our country and his very strong support of those Defence Force personnel who are resident and working within the Laverack Barrack and Townsville community. He's a staunch advocate for our veterans, and he should be very proud of that advocacy. Mr Speaker, this government has taken decisions over the course of the last few years which will stand our country in the best possible stead in a very changing and uncertain Indo-Pacific region. Mr Speaker, this has been described as a period not dissimilar to the 1930s, where we are worried about the build-up of military power, the build-up of military might by others in the region. We do know that there has been a very significant change in the stance of China, Mr Speaker, in the Indo-Pacific toward partners in the East China Sea, the South China Sea as well, Mr Speaker. And this government has taken a decision in relation to AUKUS, which is more significant than any military decision taken since the end of the Second World War by this country. And, Mr Speaker, this decision stands our country in good stead, and it gives us the best ability to keep our country safe today and into the decades ahead, Mr Speaker. Now, at the time of the AUKUS announcement 68 days ago, the Labor Party, the Leader of the Opposition, rushed out, and he couldn't have been any stronger in his support, at least at that time, for the AUKUS announcement. So it's taken 68 days, and we've seen Senator Wong sent out today, Mr Speaker, with a speech that could have been written by Paul Keating. It could have been written by Paul Keating, Mr Speaker. It was a sop to old kooky Keating. And, Mr Speaker, the reality is that Labor has always been weak on national security and border protection. If you want to look, Mr Speaker, at what they would do in government, look at what they did in opposition. This guy was the architect, Mr Speaker, along with Kevin Rudd, of the unsuccessful boat policy that resulted in people dying, Mr Speaker, and resulted in children going into detention. So, Mr Speaker, when it comes to the defence of our country, I can assure this weak Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, you don't deter an adversary, and you don't maintain peace in our region from a position of weakness. And, Mr Speaker, that is what he is advocating. Mr Speaker, the Australian public know him very well. They know him to be weak on national security. I notice the acting Chinese ambassador has been out attacking Australian values, and Senator Wong today doesn't stand up for those values. Instead, Mr Speaker, she folds in a fit of weakness, Mr Speaker, and this Leader of the Opposition is leaving no Australian uncertain as to what their view is of him. He is weak when it comes to national security.
The Minister for Defence's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for Hindmarsh.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's government has set up a system with bipartisan support to share individual vaccination records with the states to make COVID passports work. Why does the Prime Minister then claim to oppose state vaccine mandates when his government provides a system for states to enforce them?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I would have thought the Shadow Minister would be familiar with the National Plan. Mr Speaker, the National Plan provided for, as vaccination levels were rising, and indeed when they were below 80%, that there is a need for restrictions to be in place. And we work closely with the states and territories to ensure the vaccination records that we keep at a federal level could support state government policy, Mr Speaker, particularly that which was being done in accordance with the National Plan. So, Mr Speaker, we've been working together with states and territories to implement that plan, which today we see means that South Australia is opening. It means that in New South Wales and Victoria and here in the ACT people can come and they can not have to quarantine for 2 weeks. It has enabled us to bring our students back and skilled migrants, opening up to Japan and Korea and to Singapore, Mr Speaker. We're implementing the National Plan, and we've worked with the states to help the implementation of that National Plan. And, Mr Speaker, I'm puzzled, therefore, why the Shadow Minister is unaware of those elements.
The member for Robertson has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction. Can the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is securing our economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic by backing our local manufacturers? And is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reductions has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and congratulations, and thank you to the member for Robertson for her question. She knows how important manufacturing is to the economy and to her economy in the Central Coast, Mr Speaker, where there are 550 manufacturers employing 4,000 people across the Central Coast, Mr Speaker. And she also understands how important manufacturing is to the recovery from COVID, Mr Speaker, and that's why we committed $1.3 billion to the Modern Manufacturing Initiative, Mr Speaker. And we're backing our manufacturing sector in a number of areas. One of those is clean energy and recycling, Mr Speaker, where just last week we committed $44 million to support manufacturers to develop initiatives, facilities that will give them real competitive advantage in the coming years, Mr Speaker, and that includes $20 million for the Pact Group that has a site, one of 13 sites across Australia, at Summersby on the Central Coast, Mr Speaker. And just last week I was lucky enough to visit one of their other sites at Villawood, where they are converting plastics, recycling plastics, into high-quality products, Mr Speaker. And this project will provide 900 jobs and recycle 125,000 tonnes of plastics into high-quality projects. This is all about taking new technologies and working to scale up operations to provide great products for all Australians. Now, Mr Speaker, there's 80,000 more people working in manufacturing than at the beginning of the pandemic. That's 1 million Australians working in manufacturing, Mr Speaker. But I am asked about alternatives. And the alternative is what we saw when those opposite were in power. 1 in 8 manufacturing workers lost their jobs. That was 128,000 Australians lost their livelihoods, Mr Speaker. And of that 128,000, 110,000 were apprentices, Mr Speaker. 1 in 5 apprentices lost their jobs, Mr Speaker, and that was a result that followed on from those opposite putting in place a carbon tax, Mr Speaker. We saw decimation at places like Kurri Kurri. 450 Australians lost their jobs at Kurri Kurri, and it's only now we're building a gas generator there, and those opposite can't decide whether or not they're in favour of it, Mr Speaker. Some are, some aren't. Who knows which way the Leader of the Opposition is? Each way, Arbo, we never know where he stands, Mr Speaker. But one thing we know for sure—
Order. The Minister will withdraw that.
I withdraw, Mr Speaker, but we never know which way they're going to go. But one thing we can be sure of is they're always going to love a carbon tax that destroys jobs, Mr Speaker. We will support manufacturing in this country every day of the week.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure and Regional Development. Does the Minister believe that 2 workers in regional Australia who do exactly the same job should get the same pay?
The Minister for Infrastructure and Regional Development, the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I just query whether or not that really is a question to the Minister for Industrial Relations as opposed to the Minister for Regional Development. It goes to pay and conditions that don't apply just to regional areas, but to awards that would apply to workers regardless of where they are in the country. And that question should be directed to a different minister.
I'll just get you to pause for a moment there. I would ask members on my left just to, particularly when I'm being asked on a point of order, if they could give me an opportunity to actually hear the points that are being raised. I'd appreciate that. Would you mind stating that again, please, Leader of the House?
Great pleasure, Mr Speaker. That was a question in relation to industrial relations matters and should be directed to the appropriate minister. It wasn't a question about a specific award within a regional area. It was in relation to an award which would apply economy-wide, worker-wide across the economy. It was a cute way of dressing up that element, but that's really what the question went to, Mr Speaker, and it hasn't been, Mr Speaker, it hasn't been appropriately directed to the Deputy Prime Minister.
I thank the Leader of the House. I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business. I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business when I can hear. Order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. To the point of order, the implications of this ruling are huge. What the Leader of the House is effectively saying— what the Leader of the House is— careful what you wish for, just listen to this. What the Leader of the House is saying is when there's a trade deal, only the Minister representing the Minister for Trade will be allowed to answer the question. Where there's something resulting from an international agreement, only the Minister representing the Minister for Foreign Affairs will be allowed to make a response. And all the answers that we have previously had of the relevance to a trade agreement from the Minister for Education, from the Minister for Agriculture, all the other people who come with a stakeholder interest, even though they don't have policy carriage, if that's all going to be ruled out, that's what the Leader of the House is asking for. I'm recommending the wiser course is to allow the question to stand.
I thank the Manager of Opposition Business. I'm going to allow the question because it does refer to workers in regional Australia, and I call upon the Minister for Infrastructure and Regional Development.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. And it was, let's just say, lacking detail. So to try and give the proper respect to an answer, I'm only too happy to refer it to the appropriate minister who deals with that category within this House, and that is the Minister Fletcher.
The Minister has the call.
Well, I do thank the Deputy Prime Minister for referring the question to the Minister representing the Minister for Industrial Relations in this House, who is, after all, the right person to ask a question about Labor's same job, same pay bill and Labor's policy, which, of course, interestingly, is an amendment to the policy that was introduced in the Fair Work Act under the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government. The enterprise bargaining framework set out in that bill or in that act does not require that every person in a workplace be paid exactly the same. What it instead requires, if there is to be an enterprise agreement, is that persons who are covered by that agreement are better off than they would be if they were under the award. But we've heard highly misleading claims from the Labor Party. Their explanatory memorandum for this bill says, quotes, that there is a new business model based on a labour hire service provider that has distorted the labour market and undermined the enterprise bargaining system. Oh, that sounds very serious, doesn't it? That sounds extremely serious. The only problem is that it's just factually wrong. This claim that there is a growth in labour hire is not true. The statistics are very clear, Mr Speaker. The facts are that the percentage of Australians who are employed through a labour hire firm is less than 2% and has been so for a decade. The fundamental premise of Labor's bill is absolutely misplaced. Why are they doing it? Because, of course, every one of their pre-selections depends upon the approval of the union bosses. So when the union bosses click their fingers, this lot jump to attention, Mr Speaker. The fact is that just 14.3% of Australians are members of a union. That's down from 40% in 1992.
The Minister will resume his seat. The Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On point of order on direct relevance. This question
has the Minister finished his answer? Thank you. The member for Curtin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry and Minister for Science and Technology. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's investment in our critical technologies plan is creating jobs and supporting our economic recovery as we come back from the COVID-19 recession?
The Minister for Defence Industry, Minister for Science and Technology has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and congratulations on your elevation to the speakership. And can I thank the member for Curtin for her question and acknowledge her tremendous support for our tech industry in Western Australia and also across Australia. Mr Speaker, last week the Prime Minister released our blueprint for critical technologies. This blueprint sets out our vision for protecting and promoting critical technologies that are in our national interest and the economic opportunities for our industries. Mr Speaker, the 4 goals set out under the blueprint are pretty straightforward. Firstly, we must ensure we have access to and choice in critical technologies and systems that are secure, reliable and cost-effective. We must promote Australia as a trusted and secure partner for investment, research, innovation and adoption of critical technologies. Thirdly, it's essential we maintain the integrity of our research, science, ideas, information and capabilities to enable Australian industries to thrive and maximise our sovereign IP. And fourthly, we must support regional resilience and shape our international environment that enables open, diverse and competitive markets and secure and trusted technological innovation. Mr Speaker, as part of our plan, the Prime Minister, Minister Hume and I announced our government would be investing over $110 million to secure Australia's quantum future. Mr Speaker, our government is committed to supporting the commercialisation, adoption and use of this incredibly important technology to create jobs, support Australian business and to keep Australians safe. Mr Speaker, it is estimated that the development of quantum technologies in Australia can deliver Australia up to $4 billion in economic value and create some 16,000 new jobs by 2040. Mr Speaker, proudly, the Australian technology industry has emerged as one of our country's most significant employers, creating $167 billion in economic output per year and employing more than 860,000 Australians, according to new research released by the Tech Council of Australia. Mr Speaker, looking now to a new jobs frontier, space technologies are relied upon by Australians each and every day when navigating the systems in their cars and on their phones, supporting farmers, identifying the health of their crops, and also emergency workers to plan and respond to bushfires. We have a national mission, Mr Speaker, to triple the size of the space sector in Australia to $12 billion and to create up to 20,000 new jobs by 2030, and we are up to that mission.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Transport and Regional Development. These two pay slips are from two train drivers at Pacific National's coal mine in the Bowen Basin, who do the same job. One is employed by Pacific National and one by a labour hire firm. The train driver employed by the labour hire firm is a casual but still earns around $300 less every week than his colleague. What action will the government take to stop this, which is hurting workers in regional Australia and is one of the measures which is leading to the reduction in real wages across the economy?
The Minister for the Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for its question, and yet again it's very sneaky, but we should really address the question to the appropriate minister with carriage of this. And I invite Mr Fletcher to—
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Sydney. Members on my left. The member for the Minister for Industry has the floor. Minister representing the Minister for Industry.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for referring to me as the Minister representing the Minister for Industrial Relations in this House this question. And we're asked, what are we going to do about employment in regional Australia? What we're going to do is we're going to boost economic growth and we're going to make it easier for people to be employed. That's what we're going to do.
The Minister will just resume. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. This was a specific question with a real-world example about a labour hire worker doing the same job as someone else at Pacific National,
Leader of the
being
Opposition
paid
will state the point of order.
less.
The Leader of the Opposition state the point of order.
My point of order is, when the minister got the call— Well, my point of order is the minister doesn't get to ask himself a question and then answer it.
Just a moment.
That's what he did.
Leader of the Opposition, it's not helpful for those on my right to be yelling in my ear. The minister will just resume his seat for a moment. As the Leader of the Opposition knows, if you want to take a point of order, the Leader of the Opposition needs to state the point of order.
The order is this: is it in order for the minister, when he came to the dispatch— Well, when I do, sit down. It's a point of order. Sit
Leader
down.
of the Opposition.
Sit down.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. It would assist me. The Leader of the House is raising a point of order. The Leader of the House. I'm not. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
It's clear that the Leader of the Opposition makes a point of order on relevance, even though he doesn't want to say that. He refuses to state in that case what standing order he is referring to, in which case he's out of order. And, Mr Speaker, he should be ruled out of order because the minister has made a statement which is completely in order.
The Leader of the Opposition, it would assist the chair. Yeah, it would assist the chair when the Leader of the Opposition wants to raise a point of order, that you state the point of order.
My point of order goes to the standing order provisions for questions without notice, for which standing order 99, in which case I asked a question. What occurred was that the minister stood up and then asked himself a question and then proceeded to answer the question that he asked himself. That is not in order.
The minister is in order. The minister has the call. Order. The minister has the call. The minister has the call.
I do thank the Deputy Prime Minister for referring this question to me, because it goes to a very important issue about the completely fallacious presentation we're hearing from the other side of the House about this so-called same job, same pay issue, which is essentially, Mr Speaker, a made-up issue. There is no barrier. There is no barrier under Labor's own Fair Work Act to an enterprise agreement. The requirement under Labor's own Fair Work Act, Mr Speaker, the requirement under Labor's own Fair Work Act is that you can be employed under enterprise agreement as long as you are better off than under an award. Now, if that was good enough for Labor under the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years, we need to understand what has changed. The fact is, Mr Speaker, the percentage of people employed on a labour hire basis is less than 2% of employees, but the people who are really unhappy about it are the union bosses. There's only 14% of Australians who are now union members, down from 40%. What we care about, Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, you've already had a point of order. What we care about—
The minister will resume his seat. The manager of opposition business on a point of order. The minister has finished and completed his answer. The member for Lindsay has the
Congratulations and thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Employment, Workforce Skills, Small and Family Business. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government's economic plan is supporting Australian apprentices today to get into the high-quality, well-paying jobs of tomorrow? Why is it so important we invest in the skills of young Australians, and how does this contrast with previous approaches?
The Minister for Employment, Workforce Skills, Small and Family Business has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Lindsay for her question and recognise all the hard work she's doing to support the apprentices in her area, noting there are 1,750 apprentices right now working in Lindsay, the highest number ever. That's what the member for Lindsay is delivering for her area, and indeed I had the pleasure to meet many of them at Baker and Provan earlier in the year, and Prime Minister, I believe you may have also had that opportunity. It's a great achievement for the Penrith community, but also it's a great achievement for the member for Lindsay and what you're doing. It's important to the nation, especially as we build out the Western Sydney Airport or indeed help manufacture mining equipment so urgently needed in the Hunter. But Western Sydney, Mr Speaker, is not the only area that's enjoying a golden era of trade apprentices. I'm pleased to advise the House that the Morrison government economic plan has now delivered the highest number of Australian apprentices, trade apprentices, on record. 217,400 trade apprentices right now. In fact, numbers are from July, operating, training right now, highest number since records began in 1963. The Morrison government, Mr Speaker, is the best friend that apprentices have ever had. Indeed, in the face of the greatest shock since the Great Depression, the Morrison government has secured a generation of Australian trade apprentices. $6.4 billion in funding this year, on top of $5.9 billion last year. Our supporting apprentices and trainee wage subsidy provided $1.9 billion to over 74,000 employers. Our $3.9 billion boosting apprenticeship commencement wage support has surged commencements to these highest levels. In fact, over 79,000 Australians have commenced an apprenticeship or a traineeship in the last 12 months alone. And we're not done there yet, Mr Speaker. We're backing it in with our $716 million completing apprenticeship commencement wage support. Commonwealth funding to the states is at the highest level ever to back in the skills work the states are doing, whether it's funding their TAFEs or their other RTOs. Now, Mr Speaker, you know how important apprenticeships are. You started as an apprentice after your monastic sojourn. But compare that to the $1.2 billion ripped out by those opposite between 11 and 13 in 9 separate cuts. Compare that to 111,000 people dropping out in terms of traineeships and apprentices, drops in numbers from 12 to 13 because of the decisions those opposite have made. Australian apprentices, Mr Speaker, will always have a far better deal under the Morrison government.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Petrol prices have increased by as much as $900 for a typical family driving a standard car in a year, while real wages have fallen by $700. Can the Prime Minister confirm it has become harder for Australian families to make ends meet under his almost decade-old government?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Headline inflation under our government has increased by 1.8% over the time we've been in government. Under the Labor Party, it was 2.7%. Mr Speaker, electricity prices under our government, Mr Speaker, have risen on an annual average basis of 0.3%.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat for one moment. I'd just ask members of the House to please keep the level of interjections down. Thank you. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I said, electricity prices under our government since we were elected have risen on average by 0.3% a year. Under the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, they rose by 12.9%, Mr Speaker, over their time. And in most recent years, over the last 3 years, Mr Speaker, electricity prices have fallen by 3.2% on average each year. Under the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, in their last 3 years they were rising, as I said, by around 12.9% each and every year. Mr Speaker, on fuel prices in the last 3 years, they've increased by 1.2% on average per year. Under the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, they increased by 2.6% each and every year, Mr Speaker, and on average over our term of government they've increased by 0.4%, and under the Labor Party, as I said, 2.6%. What I know about petrol prices is this, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party want to change the fuel emissions standards, which is an increase in the petrol price for consumers, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party has a sneaky petrol tax, Mr Speaker, a sneaky petrol tax where they want to jack up the price of petrol.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, it goes to relevance. The question asked about petrol prices going up by $900 in the last year. It didn't invite the Prime Minister to make up policies from those on this side of the House.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister has the call. I'd ask the Prime Minister to remain relevant to the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm talking about what the impacts on petrol prices might be. And, Mr Speaker, what they might be, and what I can tell the House and what I can tell Australians is that our policies, Mr Speaker, our policies will not be changing the fuel emission standards that will put a sneaky petrol tax on Australians, Mr Speaker. Our policies will not do that.
The Prime Minister resumed his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. He's now defying your
ruling. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister is on point. The Prime Minister has the call.
Can understand why the Leader of the Opposition, with his constant interjections and coming to dispatch box, is sensitive on the issue of sneaky taxes, Mr Speaker. I can understand why he's sensitive.
The Prime Minister
tax wouldn't happen under Labor government, would it?
Manager of Opposition, just resume your seat for a moment. The Prime Minister will return to the question at hand.
So, Mr Speaker, under our government and the economic policy settings that we have put in place, under the excellent fuel security initiatives that have been put in place by the Minister for Energy, Mr Speaker, the excellent policies to secure the refinery operations that we've got up in Queensland, Mr Speaker, securing those down in Victoria as well, Mr Speaker. Those are the policies that we've put in place to protect refinery jobs. We're protecting jobs in refineries, in aluminium smelters, in the resources industry, in manufacturing, Mr Speaker. They're the policies we're putting in place.
Expired. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Parkes has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Order.
Get him out. Get him out.
The member for Parkes has the call.
My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the minister outline to the House how the coalition government is backing in Australian jobs, protecting our environment and helping our economy recover from the COVID-19 pandemic through our unprecedented recycling agenda?
The Minister for the Environment has the call.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. Congratulations to you. It's a pleasure to take a question from my friend, the member for Parkes. We share a boundary several hundred kilometres long in Western New South Wales, and I was pleased to join the member for Parkes looking at some recycling infrastructure a couple of weeks ago, because recycling and the investment it brings are very much part of the Morrison government's economic recovery. Our recycling revolution is delivering new jobs, new manufacturing processes, and most importantly, it's protecting the environment. This billion-dollar transformation of the waste and recycling sector is diverting over 10 million tonnes of resources from landfill, creating more than 10,000 new Australian jobs over the next 10 years. Right now we're seeing new recycling plants being built, new optical sorters being installed to reduce contamination, glass washing facilities creating crushed glass sand that can be used again in asphalt, bricks and buildings. Microfactories are being piloted to remanufacture glass into green ceramics, and mobile crushers are collecting single-use polypropylene waste from hospitals, granulating them on site and turning them into new plastic containers. Through our Recycling Modernisation Fund, the Commonwealth has co-funded 78 projects to date, including 23 that are in regional and remote Australia, because we understand the important role that regional and rural Australia plays in our economic recovery. Member for Parkes knows this well. We saw firsthand fantastic examples of the innovation that comes from regional communities. At the Australian Recycled Plastics Facility in Narrabri, where it's actually unique because it's one of the few facilities that can simultaneously sort HDPE, PET and coloured plastic, supporting 35 new local jobs in Narrabri. It's also great to see work being done at the Gilgandra Material Recovery Facility, providing additional processing capacity, 5 tonnes of plastic, 20 tonnes of glass, 313 tonnes of paper and cardboard each year. And these are amazing examples of regional development in important regional towns, Mr Speaker. And we've got no intention of slowing down. Waste and recycling projects supporting regional and remote New South Wales are now eligible for grants between $10,000 and $1 million for projects that improve waste management, processing and sorting. The Morrison government is backing rural and regional jobs. We're backing our unprecedented recycling agenda, and we're backing our environment.
The member for Macquarie has.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Petrol prices have gone up by as much as $900 for a typical family driving a standard car in a year, while real wages have fallen $700. On top of this, median rents in Windsor in my electorate have increased by almost $3,000 a year. Hasn't it become harder and harder for working families to make ends meet under this decade-old government?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Our government has taken numerous initiatives to take the pressure off on cost of living, and as the data reveals very clearly, Mr Speaker, particularly when it comes to petrol prices. When it comes to petrol prices, in the last 3 years alone, Mr Speaker, what we've seen is a 1.2% increase on average per year, and that compares to a 2.6% increase that occurred under the Labor years, Mr Speaker. Reference was also made to housing costs, which I know is a great challenge, particularly for younger people, and younger people who particularly want to buy into their first home. And, Mr Speaker, since we came to government, housing costs have increased, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, on an average of 1.7% each year. And in the last 3 years, they've increased by 0.6%. Now, that compares, Mr Speaker, under the Labor years to 5.1%, Mr Speaker, to 5.1%. And I know, Mr Speaker, the Minister for Housing will be able to tell you this. At the last election, I said we were going to take action to help people get into their first home. And, Mr Speaker, under the policies we've introduced since the last election, 320,000 Australians we have helped into home ownership, Mr Speaker. That's what we took to the election.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Macquarie on a point of order.
Point of order, Speaker. Relevance. My question was about rentals, not purchasing.
Yes, but the question was also about making it harder for working families to make ends meet. The Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr Speaker. And you know who's been buying those houses, Mr Speaker? People who are renting, Mr Speaker. People who are renting, and we have given them the opportunity through the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme and, Mr Speaker, the Family Home Ownership Scheme, a scheme that is helping single mums buy their first home, Mr Speaker. That is what our policies are doing. It's giving Australians who have that aspiration to go and buy a home the opportunity to go and achieve that. And since we were elected 3 years ago, Mr Speaker, 320,000 Australians have been helped into home ownership. That's what I call promise delivered, Mr Speaker. Commitment given, promise delivered. And this government will continue to do that, because under the sound economic management which is being delivered by this government, that has seen Australia through one of the greatest economic challenges since the Great Depression, Mr Speaker, that has seen Australia coming through this pandemic and the economic recovery underway, Mr Speaker, Australians can have confidence in their future. They can plan for their future with confidence. They can plan to buy their first home. They can plan to get skilled and get a job, Mr Speaker. They can plan to open and run a small business. They can plan to go and invest in new equipment that sees them get an advantage and be able to sell their products at a better price and be able to grow their business. They can do that in regional Australia, Mr Speaker, in manufacturing and recycling and in the services industry. They'll be able to do it as we're getting the students back now, Mr Speaker, in December. That is a plan that is securing our economic recovery. Those opposite, Mr Speaker, have no such plans and no such experience and no such credibility. You can't trust Labor with your money.
Expired. And I give the call to the member for O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Resources and Water. Will the Minister provide an update of the progress of important job and wealth-creating resource projects in Western Australia and outline what this will mean for the community I represent and for our economy as it recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic? Is the Minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Minister for Resources and Water has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for O'Connor for his question? Now, the member for O'Connor, Mr Speaker, has already got the super pit, but now the West is going to get the super pipe. The super pipe delivering gas from the Scarborough gas fields all the way across to the coast, Mr Speaker. Woodside yesterday, Mr Speaker, made an incredibly important final investment decision. An incredibly important decision, and that is to bring on the Scarborough gas fields and, of course, to deliver the Pluto 2 project. Now, the super pipe, Mr Speaker, is one which will deliver gas but will also deliver jobs. This is an investment of some $16.5 billion by Woodside. And we should just consider that for a moment, Mr Speaker. $16.5 billion invested by Woodside in this project. That is a vote of confidence, not only in their company but in the gas sector itself. That is a vote of confidence in the policies of the government. That is a vote of confidence in the supply of gas to customers who are willing buyers out there in the world and, of course, right across Australia. And, Mr Speaker, Woodside is targeting first gas from this project in 2026. It is a low CO2 gas, would you believe, first discovered in 1979. 1979. And we now have a final investment decision which is going to drive jobs out into the 2050s. We expect this supply to run out into the 2050s, Mr Speaker. This is an incredibly important role. 3,200 local construction jobs. Can you believe that for the West, Mr Speaker? 3,200 jobs. 600 of those are ongoing. And I'll say it again, Mr Speaker, this is a vote of confidence in the sector. It's a vote of confidence in the West. It's a vote of confidence in Woodside. And we will continue to support the resources sector, Mr Speaker, because this is how we pay for schools and roads and hospitals. The amount of money that will be delivered over the lifetime of this project, some $33 billion in direct and indirect taxation, pays for roads, schools and hospitals, Mr Speaker. This is how governments pay for the essential services that Australians rely on. But, Mr Speaker, I am asked about alternatives. Now, we know there are some alternatives, Mr Speaker. We know there are some alternatives. We know that those opposite quite simply can't stick with anything. They are always each way. You never know, Mr Speaker, what you'll get with those opposite. If we look at what's been put forward by Labor's Environmental Action Network, Mr Speaker, they want to get rid of gas stoves, gas heaters. Mr Speaker, they want to get rid of gas water heaters in particular. Mr Speaker,
the Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker,
the Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. He's not going to alternative policies at all. He's going to wild fantasies that he's making up. Like, it has to be anchored in something.
The Manager of Opposition will resume his seat. The Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, Labor Environmental Action Network. It's not the policy of our side, Mr Speaker. Labor's Environmental Action Network. So on this side, Mr Speaker, we want to continue to ensure these jobs are delivered. We want to continue to provide confidence to the resources sector, and we will do that. We want to see Australians take up these opportunities, and we want to ensure, when it comes to the post-pandemic economic recovery, Mr Speaker, projects like this go ahead because they are good for our nation.
The member for Kingston.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Petrol prices have gone up as much as $900 a week for a typical family driving a standard car in a year, while real wages have fallen by $700. On top of this, childcare fees have gone up by $390 in a year. Hasn't it become harder and harder for working families to make ends meet under this decade-old government?
Members on my right. Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you,
The
Speaker.
Prime Minister has the call.
The reason the government focuses so much, and this is our absolute focus on securing a strong economy, Mr Speaker, the reason we do that is for the very issues that the member has raised in the question. Mr Speaker, you don't make people's lives easier by increasing their taxes. You don't make their lives easier by preventing small business from growing and gumming them up in more regulation, Mr Speaker. You don't increase the ability of government to support people through their pensions and other services that they rely on, Mr Speaker, by talking down the Australian economy and trying to shut down the Australian resources industry, Mr Speaker. That's not what you do, and that's why our government has reversed those sorts of policies that were in place by the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, and as they would like to go there again, I have no doubt. And, Mr Speaker, that will be particularly the case as we go into this next election, because I understand that the Greens these days are now referring to themselves as shadow ministers, Mr Speaker. Shadow ministers in what would be a Labor-Green government, Mr Speaker. In a Labor-Green government, Mr Speaker. They're talking it up. They're talking it up. And so, you know, the Labor Party have been pretty sneaky in not telling us what their policies are.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister is not even pretending to be directly relevant. There's no attempt being made. He's completely defying the standing orders, and he's smirking about it.
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. The Prime Minister has the call. And I would ask the Prime Minister to be relevant to the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And so, Mr Speaker, our policies on reducing taxes, on affordable, reliable energy, on getting Australians into skills. We've got record levels of Australians in trade apprentices right now, Mr Speaker. That's what supports businesses to be able to support their employees, grow their businesses, increase their wages, enable them to buy a house, Mr Speaker, secure the economic recovery. That's what our policies are doing. Building the infrastructure, congestion-busting infrastructure in our cities and job-making infrastructure in our regions that enables to get it from paddock to plate to port, Mr Speaker, to ensure that our agriculture and regional industries have got the opportunities they need to support the standard of living that people in Australia deserve and expect, Mr Speaker, and we will continue to toil hard every day to ensure that we can do everything we can to support them in that. But you know who we believe in most, Mr Speaker, to deliver those things? We believe most in those Australians who go out there every day and work hard, run businesses, look after their kids, make decisions, work in their communities. We believe that Australians, Mr Speaker, are at the centre of our economic plan. Those opposite, Mr Speaker, think the government is at the centre of the plan, and the government should tax you more so they can try and increase your standard of living. Not us on this side of the House, Mr Speaker. We believe you are the answer, not the government, Mr Speaker. We think government should be getting more out of people's way as we secure this economic recovery, not cling on to those powers, Mr Speaker, which we know Labor always wants to do. Once they get their hands on power, Mr Speaker, as Australians know, they can't release it.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat, and I give the call to the member for Barara.
My question is to the Minister for Education and Youth. Will the Minister advise the House about the return of international students under the Morrison government's plan to reopen Australia, and what opportunities will create for Australians as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Education and Youth has the call.
Well, thank the member for Barara for his question. I congratulate you, Mr Speaker, and the member for Barara is a fantastic advocate for the tertiary sector, and that includes the private higher education sector, which adds so much diversity to the educational landscape. And, Mr Speaker, he, like all of us, at least on this side of the House, are pleased that the borders are reopening on the 1st of December, which means international students will be able to come back to complete their studies or to start new courses early next year. And, Mr Speaker, that's clearly beneficial for the education institutions themselves, as well as those individual students. And that's why the Chair of Universities Australia has said that he was thrilled by the Prime Minister's decision earlier this week. But international students, as the member for Barara knows, also creates enormous opportunities for Australians. And it's little known, Mr Speaker, that typically the international education market is actually our third biggest export industry, constituting about $40 billion in revenue for Australia, about half of which is in fees, but the other half is actually in expenditure from those international students on their accommodation, on restaurants, on those other small businesses, on tourism opportunities. And indeed, if through that expenditure they support 250,000 Australians in work, about a third of which are in the member's home state of New South Wales. But they also support Australians in other ways, and that is by filling many of those job vacancies that we presently have, because international students, they not only come here to study, but they're also able to do some part-time work. And as all members of this House would know, we have critical shortages of labour at the moment. And so bringing back those international students enables more of those students to be able to fulfil those jobs, and in doing so keep the cafes open, keep the restaurants open, keep those other businesses open that, of course, we enjoy and we expect to be open. And, Mr Speaker, this is why the business community has so warmly welcomed international students coming back from the 1st of December as well, with the Business Council of Australia saying that international education is responsible for creating thousands of jobs and getting students back is crucial, and as well as the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry saying that this will accelerate Australia's recovery, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is always part of our plan. Part D of our national plan. We're delivering upon it. We said we'd do it, and from the 1st of December, international students will start to come back, and that's good for Australia.
The member for Rankin has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. His decade-old government has doubled government debt before COVID, and now it's approaching a record of $1 trillion. According to reports today, budget repair won't begin until after the election. Why won't the Prime Minister reveal his secret budget cuts before the election?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, I was pleased to have question time extended today, just so that the member would be able to get a question, the Shadow Treasurer would be able to get a question. Mr. Speaker, if I had to extend question time to allow the member for Maribyrnong to get a question, we'd be here till midnight, I suspect, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy for the Shadow Treasurer. I'm very happy to have the Shadow Treasurer's question addressed by the Treasurer.
Shadow Defence Minister.
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the Speaker.
Order. The Treasurer will just pause for one moment. I don't particularly want to exercise 94A on my first day in the chair. Please, I would call upon members of the House to keep the level of interjections. I would call upon members to restrain themselves. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the 12th man of politics for his question. He's barely here and he barely gets a question. The reality is the way we repair the budget is to grow the Australian economy. It's to see more people in jobs, Mr. Speaker. It's to cut taxes, to provide more incentive for work and to encourage aspiration and reward effort. Based on the figures in the budget announced in October of last year and then the final budget outcome for 2021, there was an $80 billion improvement as a result of a stronger labour market, Mr. Speaker. Of course, there are other factors at play, but the stronger labour market was a primary factor. And the fact that today unemployment is lower than when we came to government after the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression is a sign that our economic plan is working. The fact that there are more women in work today than when we came to government, Mr. Speaker, that the gender pay gap has narrowed since we've come to government, and the fact that business investment in machinery and equipment is now at the highest level in 20 years, even despite the recession as a result of those business investment incentives. So we'll continue, Mr. Speaker, to do what is required to help the Australian economy recover from this economic shock. We had to take some very difficult but necessary actions. Programs like JobKeeper helped save 700,000 jobs. The cash flow boost, Mr. Speaker, helped support small business. Business investment incentives, the $750 payments to pensioners and carers, and millions on income support were all designed to help Australia through this economic shock. And now we're continuing to cut taxes, unlike those opposite. Taxes that have been cut to reward effort and encourage aspiration, to allow small businesses to prosper, to allow Australian families to spend more of their hard-earned money on things that are important to them. So yes, the last 2 years have been difficult, but we've taken the necessary decisions to put the Australian economy on the road to recovery, and there's only one thing that risks that recovery, and that's the Labor Party.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper, and I congratulate you on completing your first question.